Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Lord Pog and this is Lord Pog Gaming. So today I'm going to talk about the idea behind duality. Not duality in such a physical form or even necessarily a spiritual form, but the natural duality that takes place within inside people. And humankind's natural inclination to want to test the boundaries of our own moral sense of right and wrong, and why it is so much fun to dip our toe in the waters, the murky, the dark waters, if you will. Before I get started, let me just thank you all for listening and viewing and just being here. I really do appreciate it, and it helps my channel grow. I've had a lot of good feedback, and I'm at 52 subscribers now, which is more than I could ever ask for. I mean, golly, thank you all so much. I just appreciate it so much. You guys are the greatest, and I hope my channel keeps on growing. I'd like to one day do this full time, but again, I don't necessarily have the time, what with working and everything else, but I try to keep pumping out content for y'all as much as I possibly can. So thank you for being understanding and for just being here. If you like what I do, please like, share, and subscribe, and let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact of duality. What is duality? What does it mean? What does it represent within inside ourselves? I could go into the description of duality, and I could go into its spiritual meaning, the idea of right and wrong, good and evil, and then people of being a dual nature in a more material sense. But that's not quite what we're here for today. We're going to kind of look at both, and we're going to sort of mesh them together. First, let me talk about the two wolves. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this story, the story of the two wolves. The story of the two wolves is an interesting one. It's a popular legend. A lot of people claim it's a Cherokee Native American legend, but it actually, the sources of it actually go back to a Christian. It's like a Christian parable, which is interesting that it would be looked at as a Cherokee Native American legend, but it seems that early Christians in America penned it as a Native American legend. But the legend goes, a grandfather is talking about two wolves that fight inside of you, the inner conflict, and he's telling this to his grandson, and he says, my son, there is a battle between two wolves inside us all. One is evil, it is anger, jealousy, greed, resentment, inferiority. It has lies, and it is ego. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, humility, kindness, empathy, and truth. So the boy thought about it and asked, Grandfather, which of the wolves wins? And the old man replied, the one you feed. This is an example of duality within inside people. Man's sense of duality, how inside of us we have this conflict that takes place between the two halves of us, the side of us that is prideful and angry and lustful, dare I say, as opposed to the side of us that is humble and kind and peaceful and just wants love and joy. That is a very spiritual sense of duality, if you will. Another good example of this duality comes from the Bible. And now don't misunderstand me when I'm telling you this, what am I talking about? When I'm talking about what is written here, this isn't my attempt to convert anybody to Christianity or anything like this. I'm just using this as an example because much like the tale of the two wolves, this also speaks of man's duality. And As far as the Bible goes, and I am familiar with the Bible and its teachings and its writings, I have always found this particular scripture poetic, the way that Paul the Apostle wrote this in the book of Romans. I highly encourage that you stick with me here and just listen to what he's talking about when it comes to duality. Okay, so we're starting in Romans 7, and we're starting in verse 14, and we're going to read this whole thing so you can understand what it is that I'm talking about when I talk about the duality of man. Because like I said, this is very poetic what he writes here, what Paul the Apostle wrote here. And again, this isn't to convert anybody. I'm not trying to preach at anybody, so that's not my purpose. But just so you know, I am familiar with the scripture here. So I have always found this extremely poetic in the way that Paul describes duality of man. For we know that the law is spiritual. In Romans 7, verse 14, starting in 14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am fleshly, sold into bondage to sin. For I do not understand what I am doing. For I am not practicing what I want to do, but I do the very thing that I hate. However, if I do the very thing that I do not want to do, I agree with the law that the law is good. But now, no longer am I the one doing it, but the sin that dwells in me. For I know that the good does not dwell in me, that this is in my flesh. For the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I do the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but the sin that dwells in me. I find then the principle that is evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully agree with the law of God in the inner person, but I see a different law in the parts of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin, the law which is in my body's parts. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? So, and then he goes on to saying in the last bit of that, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin. That is Paul's take on duality. The idea that your mind and body are not always necessarily one. Your flesh will want one thing and your mind will want another. Then when we look at the story of the two wolves, what is the grandfather telling his grandson in that story? He is talking to him about the beast you feed. Which wolf will you feed? Because they're at war with each other. So Paul's two wolves in that scenario are your mind and body, while the grandfather's is good and evil. I mean, that's basically the whole take on this. Now, why am I talking about this in the first place, you ask? You're like, what relevance does this have, Pog, to any gaming whatsoever? Well, dear listener or viewer, so glad you asked. Let's talk about a little game known as Vampire the Masquerade. Vampire the Masquerade is a game that takes place within a connected universe of games by White Wolf Publishing. White Wolf Publishing has a whole series of tabletop RPGs, or TTRPGs, which they call the World of Darkness, basically. And Vampire the Masquerade is probably the most popular of them. Now, there could be some arguments there. People might say, well, no, Werewolf the Apocalypse is better, or Mage the Ascension, or whatever. But let's face it, Vampire the Masquerade is what put the World of Darkness on the map, and put White Wolf Publishing on the map. I'm not here to argue about which one is a better game, per se. Just let's talk about the one that is that paved the way for all the others. The Wikipedia says about Vampire the Masquerade is a tabletop role-playing RPG created by Mark Rain Hagen and released in 1991 by White Wolf Publishing as the first of several storyteller system games for its World of Darkness setting line. It is set in a fictionalized gothic punk version of the modern world where players assume the role of vampires, who are referred to as kindred, and deal with their night-to-night struggles against their own bestial natures, vampire hunters, and each other. So that's it in a nutshell. That's really what Vampire the Masquerade is. Now, what they don't tell you is the reason why the game is called Vampire the Masquerade is because what the Masquerade really is. And mind you, I've never played Vampire the Masquerade. I just know a lot about it because I'm pretty familiar with the big names of TTRPGs. That's Dungeons and Dragons, Vampire the Masquerade, or VTM as some people call it, Call of Cthulhu, Shadowrun. Games like that I'm pretty familiar with. Whether I've played them or not, I'm familiar enough with them. There is a pretty good, on YouTube, there's a pretty good channel dedicated to Vampire the Masquerade called, there's one called LA Nights, and then there's one called New York Nights, I believe, where their storyteller, Jason Carl, gathers up all his favorite role players, and they all play. It's kind of like Critical Role for Vampire the Masquerade, and it's a pretty good show. So I suggest checking it out. I'll put a link in the description for it if you're interested in watching how that game is played. It's pretty interesting, and they're actually, in a real roundabout way, they're kind of what gave me the inspiration for this video in the first place, because the way you play Vampire the Masquerade is the idea that you are a vampire, and you do not want the rest of the world to really know that you exist. So there is this system put up called the Masquerade, and you do not break it for nothing. For nothing. You have to always make sure that you're wearing a mask, if you will, to the rest of the world. That the rest of the world never knows that vampires exist, because once upon a time they did, and the Inquisition took place. That's really what the Inquisition was about, was killing off the vampires. And there's all kinds of crazy lore dating back to all of that, and I don't know all of it. So if any fans are listening to this or watching this, please feel free to tell me about it in the comments. Now, what are you in Vampire the Masquerade? You are a vampire. Well, what is a vampire, and what does it mean to be a vampire? It's that duality that you are playing with in Vampire the Masquerade. The book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I know this is going to come way out of pocket right now, but the book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, was a Gothic novella written by Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson. What it talks about is a man who is he's a lawyer, and he's friends with a Henry Jekyll. Henry Jekyll just happens to be friends with a murderer criminal named Edward Hyde. And the entire book is about what does Henry Hyde have over Edward Hyde have over this Dr. Henry Jekyll, who is pretty much a pillar of the community. Again, the guy you're following around, John Utterson, excuse me, I hiccuped. This lawyer you're following around, John Utterson, he looks at Henry Jekyll as a pillar of the community. He's a good guy, so why would he be, tied up with this man, Edward Hyde, who basically, one of the first introductions you have of him is the fact that people were eyewitnessing him basically knocking a person over and then stomping on them. And that's about the best I can describe of this. But yeah, I mean, he gets in trouble for a physical altercation. But it's like a really brutal physical altercation. Edward Hyde is not to be trifled with. Now, if you've never read this book, I suggest you go out and read it. But I am going to give a spoiler to what is going on in that if you've never read this. But it is by far one of my favorite books. I love Robert Louis Stevenson's works in the first place. But this is probably one of the greatest because it talks about duality. Okay, spoiler alert, real quick. If you haven't read it and you want to read it, go ahead, go out and read it. It's not a very long book, and then come back. But I'll give you a minute. Alright, now, this book talks about the duality of man. Because what it turns out to be is Henry Jekyll develops a formula, a serum, if you will, that allows him to take his inner evil. And we've talked about this in a previous video that I just did, talking about facing your shadow self, your inner demons, and facing up to them and learning how to accept them for what they are so you can see what is good about yourself. And not saying you should give in to the shadow, but acknowledge the shadow and acknowledge the fact that you have this inner evil, and that way you can better let the good in you shine and you can persevere and overcome, because it does you no good to push this down. Again, I just did a video about it. You can check it out. It's called Face Thyself, and it talks about Link in The Legend of Zelda. I use that game as my example for that particular topic. Now, in this, Henry Jekyll, however, develops a serum that basically turns him into his shadow self. And a lot of people misinterpret what this book is really about. They think, oh, well, it's Dr. Jekyll seeing if he can find a way to overcome the evils within inside himself, and then it ends up overtaking him and he ends up dying. That's not what happens. What's really happening there is Dr. Jekyll just wanted a way to be evil and not get in trouble for it. A mask, if you will, a masquerade. He wants to participate in a masquerade. He doesn't want anybody to know that he's capable of such dastardly deeds, so he turns himself into Edward Hyde, and it ends up biting him in the rear end at the end. The reason why I'm talking about this in particular, in conjunction with the two wolves, the mind and body not wanting to work with one another, and Vampire the Masquerade, is because in Vampire the Masquerade, that is the biggest appeal of this game, is the fact that you get to play a vampire. And vampires do not live by the same laws that we do as mortals. The laws of, as C.S. Lewis once wrote, the laws of human nature. And if you've never read that book, I also highly recommend that. C.S. Hog's addendum here. Sorry about that. I made a mistake. The book in of itself isn't called The Laws of Human Nature. The book is called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1 is called The Law of Human Nature, in which C.S. Lewis says two basic points. Human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and cannot really get rid of it. They do not, in fact, behave in that way. They know the law of human nature. They break it. This is a really interesting book. It's called Mere Christianity, and I highly suggest reading it, because it does have a lot of interesting facts about humans and the way that they behave in accordance to the laws of nature and their own nature. I highly suggest it. Again, he didn't just write the Chronicles of Narnia and fantasy fiction. He actually wrote interesting, insightful, intellectual, psychological, how many more words can I use here? But he wrote a lot of interesting stuff like that. Stuff that delves into all of that. So I suggest checking it out. Thank you. Lewis, the guy who wrote The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Chronicles of Narnia, he's actually got a lot of more interesting, more in-depth books like the Screwfly tapes and and maybe I'm not saying that name right, but I believe it's called the Screwfly tapes and the Law of Human Nature. We as people live by this law of human nature. You know, the kind of do unto others as you want done unto you, or be good to others, and this and that, the golden rule type of thing. What Vampire the Masquerade allows us to do is be our Mr. Hyde, be our Edward Hyde, and shed that mortal coil and get to be something more, not dastardly. No, I'm not saying that in Vampire the Masquerade you are necessarily evil, but you are definitely an anti-hero, no matter how you slice it. Even if you're a vampire who ultimately wants to do the right thing, and really that game is about that. You know, you can't just run around and do like the worst of the worst, because you have what is called your bestial nature. That is, that if you let that thing take you over, you do too much and you lose too much humanity, like a sense of who you were as opposed to who you are now, you'll go crazy and do a lot of bad stuff anyways. However, you still have to do things like feed, and you still have to do it's a hierarchy. That game is really socially interactive, I guess you could say. There's a lot of social espionage that goes on in that game, and different hierarchies and climbing the vampiric ladder and necks you have to step on and things of that nature. So no matter what you do in that game, regardless, you will have to do some Edward Hyde stuff to succeed. And that's the appeal of the game. The idea of dipping your toe in the murky waters, in the depths of our shadow, and getting away with it. That's the thing. It's encouraged in this game. And I feel like that is the biggest appeal of it. A lot of people might say, well, I mean, they're vampires, right? Isn't it natural selection in that sense? Survival of the fittest? Yes and no. I mean, vampires are not the same species as humans, I guess you could say. So it makes sense. Like, humans are like, they're cattle. Like, we're people. We have actual cattle, and there are cattle. Well, you have vampires, and then you have people, mortals, and people are their natural cattle. It makes sense, but is that actual natural selection? To an extent, yes. When Darwin talked about natural selection, he was talking about, adaptation and the mutations that take place that allow certain species to survive as a result of their adaptations, their mutations, if you will. Survival of the fittest, though, see, that is often what we get confused. See, survival of the fittest, we think, means the strongest, the smartest. People often make that mistake. You'll see television shows, all over the place, that some are called survival of the fittest. And then you have shows like Survivor and things like that, where it's all about your physical prowess or how smart you are and how well you can play the game and things like that. That's not true survival of the fittest, though. Survival of the fittest, at its core, from a direct quote of Charles Darwin, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. And that is the most interesting aspect, and I believe this really does tie into Vampire the Masquerade. In Vampire the Masquerade, you start off a mortal who gets, usually, if you're a seasoned player, you might just start off as a vampire, but as a new player, it's usually suggested that you play a newly turned vampire who was once immortal, who's now trying to figure out how to become an immortal. That adaptability to change. You don't necessarily have to be the smartest vampire to begin with, or the strongest one. In fact, you're not going to be neither. But depending on how well you adapt to your new environment will depend on how well that character survives. And that is key. This is the beauty of this game, Vampire the Masquerade. It not only plays into really what is natural selection and a human's duality, everybody's natural duality, it also lets us toy with it in such a way that there's really no harm, I guess you could say. Games like this are only as evil as you make it, folks. I'm going to tell you this right now. Alright, I'm not accusing nobody of playing these really grimy, gruesome games and blah blah blah, and they're out there doing sadistic stuff, and no, but it is what it is, right? This isn't an adult game. This is an adult game. And so you play how you want, however your storyteller is going to play, and you do what you do. proceed with caution. If you've never played before, just be ready because you don't really know. You're a vampire. You're technically a monster in this game, so you're going to do monstrous stuff. But that is the appeal. The duality within human nature, our Mr. Hyde to our Dr. Jekyll. We play Vampire the Masquerade. The hugest appeal to Vampire the Masquerade is the fact that you get to be Mr. Hyde. You get to delve into your shadow self, and there is no real repercussion for it. At least there shouldn't be. Again, when it comes to TTRPGs, whether it be Dungeons and Dragons, Vampire the Masquerade, Call of Cthulhu, Shadowrun, any of them, it is always wise for a storyteller, a dungeon master, the keeper, whatever you're playing as, it is always wise for that ref basically to talk to his players and find out what their threshold is, how much they can take, and then making sure that you don't put anything in there that's going to be uncomfortable for them. I want to put that out there and let people know that that's what you should do if you're going to play this game. Any of these games for that matter. Regardless, Vampire the Masquerade is one of those funny ones that if you're playing it, you're kind of signing up for a little bit more of a racier, more graphic, more adult game than probably the others have to offer unless you purposely make them as adult as you possibly can. Vampire the Masquerade already kind of starts off pretty adult, and me personally, I don't see nothing wrong with that. Consenting adults, you do what you do, right? Just know what your limit is and don't surpass it, and make sure that your GM, basically your game master, knows what your limit is, and make sure he's the kind of guy or girl who won't surpass that, and make you uncomfortable just to do it. Now that I feel like I've put out enough of a disclaimer here, I want to end this once again by just talking about the duality of humans, of people. We are a two-minded people. We are. And what I mean by two-minded, I mean there is inside of us our light and our darkness. And that is what's so neat about Vampire the Masquerade. Again, I will end this by saying it one last time. Vampire the Masquerade allows us to delve into not Dr. Hyde, but Mr. Hyde side of ourselves. What we get to do in Vampire the Masquerade, we wouldn't really be able to do in real life. And we like that. And we're beautiful, and we're strong, we're powerful. Some of the vampire clans, and again, Vampire the Masquerade is just crazy. Let's talk about it for just a minute. There's all these clans. I can't name them all off. Some of them are beautiful. Some of them are wretched looking. I mean, it's crazy. You got a vampire clan called the Toreador, and they're all like the artists and stuff. Think like Jim Morrison from The Doors, all poetic and larger than life and supposedly gorgeous to, everybody. He would be a Toreador. And then you got groups like the Nosferatu, the clans like Nosferatu. And think the movie, the black and white movie, Nosferatu. That's basically what they are. They're ghouls, basically, but they're also like some of the best. They're like one of the best clans out there, actually. They have all the secrets of all the other clans, and they're actually pretty strong, stealthy little soldiers. I mean, they're awesome. My personal favorite are the Tzimisce. Out of all the clans I've ever researched and studied, I like the Tzimisce. They're just nuts. They're like body horror, like just crazy. I guess, and the last time I heard, and I'm probably wrong now because I'm sure that the lore has moved on from this, but the last I heard, somebody like Count Dracula would have been a Tzimisce because he was capable of like body morphing and doing all this crazy stuff. And I just dig it. I've never played the game, just never had time to. But, maybe one day. I don't know if I'm willing to really delve into that much of my own dual nature myself. But, I mean, more power to you. And that's what's neat about this game is that not only does it allow you to delve into your dual nature, but it also gives you like multiple clans that allow you to delve into that dual nature. So depending on the clan you play, really is going to talk about something about you and what that dual nature really is inside of you. Like I said, you could be a Samitsi, this body morphing, like, terror upon the countryside, like, you know, Vlad the Impaler. Or you could be like a Toreador, who's beautiful and gorgeous, but deadly, you know? Think Galadriel. I am beautiful and deadly all at once, and you shall all love me in despair, you know? Crazy stuff like that. So, humankind has this dual nature, and Vampire the Masquerade gives us so many options to delve into those different aspects of our Mr. Hyde. And I dig it. I really do. I really do dig it. I myself, like I said, never played it, and just because mainly I don't know if I'm really prepared to delve into all these darker aspects of myself. But more power to those of you who do. With that said, I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this. Again, if you like what I'm doing here, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave me a comment, and I'll see you on the next one, alright? Thank you guys so much. You all are so much of a blessing to me. 52 subscribers. Gee whiz. I just can't imagine. I know there's people who get really happy when they got like 100 or 100,000. I don't know if it's commonplace to be this happy over just 50 subscribers, but let me tell you, my 50 subscribers mean so much to me and are a huge blessing to me. And even if you're not subscribed, if you just are stopping by and listening and watching, you're a blessing to me too. And I just want to thank all of you. I love you all so much, and y'all come back now. You hear?